It's that wee town in Donegal, Rathmullen by the sea.
The 19th century was one of great changes, and our own local story reflects this. In this short film, we draw back the curtain on the material world of 19th century Rathmullen people, and so perhaps better understand their mental world. Fortunately for us, it was a century dedicated to collecting and recording statistics of every kind at government level. The people were counted, their dwellings were valued, and the quality of the land was assessed. Complementing all these statistics was the Ordnance Survey mapping of the early 1830s. These records, together with many other written accounts and articles in newspapers, directories and diaries, give an insight into that time. Though it may be hard to visualise now, maybe we can understand the town and its people a little better as we take this trip down memory lane.
The original settlers in the area were probably on higher ground to the southwest. By the 16th century, the McSweeney clan had a stronghold on the prominent coastal location on the hilly head. Nearby, the abbey was built by 1516. Nearly another 100 years on, following the plantation, Bishop Andrew Knox made his home there, where a small development of houses for 100 settlers had been built up. And so, the town developed mainly southwards from there. By the 19th century, the town boundaries were set for the purposes of valuations and other official records. The boundary to the south was at McMacken's. Going north, the first Coastguard station was the boundary. The gate end was the western boundary on the Auchterlin Road, and Morrison's was the last house before the Ahavenin eastern boundary. Captain William Smith, assistant engineer, provided fine sketches of Rathmullen town scenes in 1801. At the time of the 1834 Ordnance Survey mapping, the footprint of most of the latter-day structures to the south was established. The town was built on both sides of the road from Ramelton. This was Main Street, starting from the McMacken's house to the Abbey. Pound Street, which extended from the middle of Main Street, had 14 small houses and the Pound. Wesleyan Street was not built on then. From the Abbey, the road continued to the site of the original Coastguard station and the ferry house shore side. A few houses were located on both sides of the turn on the road, just before the battery. Dating from 1828, the Presbyterian Meeting House was the last building on the left. The first Ordnance Survey of 1834 and the first Town Land Survey circa 1837 illustrate the development of the town from the early 17th century, when Bishop Andrew Knox took possession of the estate. In 1834, it was offered for sale by the then landlord Knox. The family had moved to Prehen in Derry in the previous century. The first advertisement for the sale of Rathmullen town and environs in the Derry Journal in February 1834 painted a scenic picture. A somewhat different view of Rathmullen was expressed by Lieutenant William Lancy of the Ordnance Survey later in that same year, 1834. The first town land valuation in 1837 records 117 poorer class houses, probably the type referred to by William Lancy as stone cottages, 1 story high, occasionally whitewashed with glass windows and thatched roofs. These houses, being valued at less than £3 10 shillings, were exempt in the valuation. The remaining 19 houses within the town boundaries were valued from £3 10 shillings to £16 16 shillings. The latter was the Priory House at the junction of Main Street and Wesleyan Street, making a total of 136 houses then within the town boundaries. As Captain Smith's sketches indicate, the exempt houses could be single houses or in groups from 2 to 8 houses. The public buildings in 1837 included the police barracks, a corn and flax mill on the seaside of the road, St Columb's Church, the Abbey, and in Kerrs Bay there was the Battery, the Presbyterian Meeting House, and the original Coast Guard Station and Ferry House. The devastating famine in the 1840s brought about huge changes in succeeding decades, leading to the clearance of many of the poorest habitations, but by no means all. Increased emigration in subsequent decades also resulted in fewer houses and a reduction in the town's population. The biggest change in the seascape in the following decades was the disappearance of almost all the houses on the main street on the seaside of Main Street, 30 houses in all. The only surviving houses in that stretch were the two adjoining houses, which were subsequently combined to become the Rathmullen Arms Hotel and the house at Ardachashel, which served as the next police barracks, thereafter a shop, and in the early 20th century it was the post office. What we see today on the opposite side of the road from the beginning of Old Main Street to the Abbey are mostly the same number of houses with the same footprint greatly modified, which became two-storey houses with slated roofs. Records of the occupations of the people in general are scarce from the beginning of the century. Most of the townspeople were involved in manual work. A number of farmers with land in the neighbouring townlands lived in the town, and so too did a number of farm labourers and household servants. There was always a need for blacksmiths, and the town had a few. Fishing was a most important industry, and given that 5 men usually manned a boat, the numbers engaged in fishing were big in the early decades of the century. Lancy's memoir, written up by November 1834, refers to the trades and occupations in the wider parish, including grocers, butchers, shoemakers, coopers, carpenters, tailors, and masons. His memoir too suggests a growing variety of occupations as services developed, such as the penny post, the Court of Petty Sessions, and the dispensary. Slater's Directory of 1870 is very informative regarding the main occupations. This directory in 1894 was the golden pages of its time. It lists the people involved in business and trade in the town. The census of 1901 gives the names and occupations of most adults. The occupations given for men reflect the influence of the seaside location for fishing and holidaymaking. Indeed, at the end of the 19th century, Rathmullen was becoming increasingly popular as a holiday resort. It is interesting to note what William Lancy suggested in 1834. The majority of women were listed as housekeepers. Needless to say, that covered a multiplicity of careers and jobs as well as household chores. Perhaps the most tongue-in-cheek entry is for a Nancy Bradley, who at the age of 65 lists orange seller as her occupation. Funding for formal schooling was recorded in the select vestry of the Church of Ireland before 1800 in Ahavan and Killygarvan townlands. By the end of the 19th century, the 1901 census shows 95% of the town's population aged over 10 years of age was literate. By 1815, a new parish school was under construction beside St Columb's Church. It was part funded thereafter from the Robertson bequest and enrolled children from all religious denominations. For a time after mid-century, the school catered for boys only, when an infant school and female school operated in Pound Street, established under the national system by Thomas Batt. In 1831, the national school system was introduced to cater for the vast majority of Irish children having no formal schooling. In 1872, the second national school was established on the main street by Reverend Bernard Walker. The number on the rolls had increased greatly 20 years later when school attendance became compulsory. The school was then divided into two separate schools, male downstairs and female upstairs. Inspectors' reports on overcrowding and unsuitable conditions on both floors resulted in the construction of a new premises at the gate end, St Joseph's National School. It opened in 1902 and was divided into two schools, the boys' school and the girls' school. The two amalgamated in 1934 as one mixed school. The school's collection of 1937 from the Robertson National School and St Joseph's, based on reminiscences of local people from childhood from the 1850s onwards, is a great resource for the lore and customs of the preceding century. Some of the local older generation whose stories were collected included John Begley, aged 65, John McCollum, aged 70, Tom Holland, 50, John O'Connor, 67, Mrs. Toy, 70, and Hugh O'Donnell, 91. One type of entry relating to the later 19th century noted the most common homemade toys. Boats made from tin or wood, even a feather stuck in a cork could pass as a yacht given the right wind. Dolls and clothes for them, catapults, whistles fashioned from hollow sticks, jewellery from daisies and rosehips, turnip lanterns and fishing lines. The story of schooling in Rathmullen is well documented in the book A Century of Schooling in Rathmullen by Mary Bowden, published in 2002.
The oldest building from the early 16th century was the Abbey. Originally a Carmelite friary, it became the fortified residence of Bishop Andrew Knox early in the 17th century. From before 1706, the Knox family chapel served as the parish church for the Church of Ireland. While divine worship continued in the chapel for more than a century, the rest of the former abbey fell into disrepair around it. That history is well delineated in The Abbey, a book by Patricia Deeney in 2011. In recent years, the Abbey building has been carefully restored through public funding. A new parish church, St Colum's, completed in 1814, was built on a site to the southwest, thereafter known as Church Hill. By 1828, a Presbyterian meeting house was established in the then largely uninhabited north part of Cares Bay. In 1872, the present Presbyterian Church was opened on what was the new road. Other developments on this greenfield site around this time included shops and houses. It was named Pier Road. In 1844, members of the local congregation obtained a lease for the site of a Methodist meeting house and a manse. The meeting house and the manse were constructed on the later named Wesleyan Road. St Catherine's Church, Legland, was built in 1792. While it was situated in the centre of the parish, it was a long trek for Rathmullen people for Sunday Mass. In 1892, a new church for the Catholic population was opened in Rathmullen. It was dedicated to St Joseph. The rebellion of the United Irishmen at the end of the 18th century led to measures by Britain to maintain the status quo in Ireland. Security was increased along the northwestern seaboard following the French expedition led by Wolfe Tone. Signal towers along the coast preceded the construction of 6 defensive forts along Lough Swilly. The Rathmullen Battery was one of these forts, built around 1812. As a military installation, it was off-limits to the civilian population and had little significance for Rathmullen people. Throughout the 19th century, it was left unmanned by the British Army from 1879. As part of the 1921 treaty ending the War of Independence, Britain retained 3 Irish ports for defensive purposes: Queenstown, now Cove, Bearhaven and Lough Swilly. This continued until 1938, when the ports, including the military forts on Lough Swilly, were handed over to the Irish government. In the later 20th century, the battery was used for a number of different community projects. That story, as well as the early battery history, has been captured in a film of the battery, produced for the inaugural Rathmullan Film Festival. The original Waterguard station, marked on the Ordnance Survey map, was on the seaside of the road and consisted of a watchtower, a boathouse, 3 small houses for the guards. Later, under the control of the Admiralty, the new Coast Guard station was constructed in 1875. It had housing for 7 guards, a watchtower, and a larger residence for the head Coast Guard. The duties of the Coast Guards included the prevention of smuggling, assisting in sea rescues, dealing with shipwrecks, and the detection of poaching making on offshore islands. The Coast Guard families in the station formed a significant portion of the more transient population noted in church records and in the local schools. The first Irish constabulary barracks on Upper Main Street, shown in the 1830s Ordnance Survey map, was still located there in 1858. Its next location was at Ardagh Cashel. Around the end of the century, the barracks was based in what was formerly a convalescent home for women on Pound Street. After independence, the Guards moved there, later transferring to the Pier Road. Like the Coast Guards, the constabulary families were a significant part of Rathmullen's transient population. There was no official help for those in dire poverty at the beginning of the century. Poverty was the catalyst for emigration before the famine, and increasingly so afterwards. In pre-famine times, ships travelled out from Lough Swilly bound for North America. The poor law unions were established throughout Ireland prior to the famine. This area was in the Milford Union, set up in July 1841. The workhouse opened its doors in April 1846, at the height of the famine. Each union was responsible for the operation of the workhouse and some outdoor relief. The aim was to dissuade all but the most destitute from being dependent on the workhouse through a meagre diet, forced separation of spouses and children, and the requirement to work for one's keep. Inspectors were appointed to oversee the workings of the union. One such inspector was Caesar George Otway. He married Elizabeth Hannah Batt, daughter of Thomas Batt, Rathmullen landlord. It seems most likely that Otway Golf Club takes its name from him. The Dispensary Act of 1833 provided for a medical doctor in each dispensary district. The Rathmullen Dispensary was later built on Main Street. Medical attendance was twice a week in the dispensary by the 1870s. From the mid-century, babies and young children were being routinely vaccinated against smallpox at the dispensary. In 1881, Dr. Michael Loughnane, physician, was also the registrar of births, marriages and deaths. In the early decades, a part of McMacken's house was designated and kept in readiness to serve as a sick bay whenever needed for sick or injured men from the Royal Navy. The story is that 2 nieces of the novelist Jane Austen, Louisa and Mariana, who lived in Balliar House, Ramelton, promoted the construction of a large 3-storey house on Pound Street for ladies in need of rest and recuperation following illness. Its reopening after refurbishment was advertised in the Derry Journal in 1895. A few years later, the RIC barracks was located there. The post office premises noted in 1834 was at Samuel Henderson's house on Church Hill. Around this time, the facility of the prepaid penny post was established. Next, the post office was moved to Henderson's property at the junction of Main and Wesleyan Street. Early in the 20th century, the next location was Ardagh Cashel, where the postmaster was Mr. John Deany. The extension of the mail car service to smaller towns prompted better road conditions. Later, bigger carriages were used for the mail, which accommodated paying passengers. Since 1971, the postmistress here on Main Street is Bernadette Kelly, and the post office now faces an uncertain future due to the closure of smaller post offices. Featured in last year's film festival was a film from Monica and Martin Kelly celebrating the 50th anniversary of Bernadette's term as postmistress. The grand jury, forerunner to the county council, was responsible for making and repairing roads and bridges for transport, piers and harbours, and the construction of courthouses and support of district hospitals. The roads in the 1830s were in very poor shape, according to Lieutenant Lancy. His opinion was that apart from the road from Rathmullen, the other roads out of the town were only suitable for farm carts. Conditions must have improved greatly by 1897, when Percy French wrote about two young ladies who cycled merrily out of Rathmullen by Killygarvan Bridge on their newfangled cycle machines. Nothing impeded their enjoyable trip until they found the road had turned into a rough track at the foot of Knockalla Hill. This was 74 years before the spectacular Knockalla Coast Road was officially opened. The Royal Navy featured largely in the life of Rathmullen throughout the century. William Lancy decried the lack of a pier to facilitate the ships of the Royal Navy and the boats for local fishermen. He noted that small boats were just hauled ashore and that the King's boat and other large boats had to lie offshore at anchor. This lack was addressed by the landlord Thomas Batt. In 1845, he applied to the Office of the Treasury for funding to have a pier built. The office approved £1,800 and £450 was raised at a local level. About £190,000 and £48,000 in today's money. The pier was completed in 1849 and 4 years later was handed over to the grand jury. By the beginning of the 19th century, it was stated that up to 3,000 people used it annually, consisting mostly of people travelling to and from Derry on business, members of the Royal Navy, and people involved in fishing, as well as an increasing number of tourists and commercial travellers. From the 19th century, a ferry service operated across the Swilly to and from Rathmullen. With the arrival of the Londonderry and Lough Swilly Railway in Inishowen in 1863 and the construction of the new pier at Faughan 5 years later, the ferry took on a new importance in connecting people between the two peninsulas. A further improvement for ferry travellers before the end of the century was the arrival of steam-driven power replacing oars and sails.
The first regatta was held in 1833 and has continued since. It was initially a 4-day regatta. The main events then included races for yachts of different weights and for rowing boats and sailing boats of different lengths. Other events included races for Norway skiffs, the Trondheims, which originated from Trondheim, or boats belonging to fishermen residing on Lough Swilly. The fierce competition between local fishermen and crews from ships of the Royal Navy, and especially between the fishermen on this side of the Swilly and those of the far side, has become the stuff of local legends. New events such as swimming races, bicycle races, a duck hunt and the greasy pole were added to the programme over the years. The Rathmullen Regatta was eagerly anticipated and enjoyed by men, women and children from far and wide. Extra train services for the big event, running from Derry to Faughan and Buncrana and back to link up with the ferry, were provided later in the century. By then, the Rathmullen Regatta had become one of the main summer events in the northwest. The regatta continues to draw large crowds to Rathmullen, and its spirit has been captured by local photographers Arthur Lynch and Paul Deeney. The courthouse was the venue for indoor events and entertainment, especially concerts, with a great variety of local talent showcased there. Many concerts were organised to raise money for local ventures and were usually reported on in the Derry Journal. Two concerts of special interest include the one to raise money for the local football team founded by Daniel Dini, Donal O'Divne, and another big concert starring Cathal McGarvey. These two men were contemporaries and acquaintances, and both were involved in the Gaelic League dedicated to the revival of the Irish language and Irish culture. Daniel mainly in County Galway and Cathal in Dublin. Soccer kicked off here when Daniel Dini, 1868 to 1923, started the first football team, the Caradones, in 1888, the forerunner of today's White Strand United and Rathmullen Celtic football teams. This was soon after Daniel, a newly trained teacher from Turladen, Glenvar, started his career in Caradone National School. By 1894, Daniel had established the County Donegal Football Association, and a new competition for the Donegal Challenge Cup got off the ground. The local team was then known as Swilly Rangers. In December 1894, Swilly Rangers benefited from a concert in the courthouse to raise funds for this team. In 1896, Daniel announced his resignation from the association at a meeting in the Pier Hotel because he was taking up a teaching post in Anspidgel, County Galway. His farewell function was organised by the landlord Thomas Batt in the Arms Hotel in Rathmullen. In Anspidgel, Daniel dedicated himself through the Gaelic League to the promotion of Gaelic heritage and culture, and so most likely promoted Gaelic football thereafter. Cathal McGarvey, 1866 to 1927, was the son of Samuel and Catherine McGarvey, Main Street, Rathmullen. Cathal was an activist in the Gaelic League, and his business premises at Anstad, North Frederick Street, Dublin, became a very popular venue for Gaelic League meetings. Cathal, a singer, actor and entertainer, is popularly remembered now as the lyricist of the much-loved song The Star of the County Down. He gave a concert here in the courthouse in 1912, the same year as Feis Tyrconnell was held in Rathmullen, featuring many interesting competitions and displays to promote Irish heritage, culture and crafts. From Bantry Bay to Derry Quay, and from Galway to Dublin town, no maid I've seen like the sweet Colleen that I met in the County Down. As she onward sped, sure I scratched my head, and I looked with a feeling rare. And I says I, to a passer-by, who's the maid with the nut-brown hair? He smiled at me, and he says he, that's the gem of Ireland's crown. It's Rosie McCann from the banks of the Bann. She's the star of the County Down.
Photography was invented during the century and became a marvellous tool in understanding the past. Photographer Delia Lawless lived in Cares Bay from about 1911 until her death in 1943. Throughout that time, she was a photographer in residence here, with a little studio next to her home. Delia captured the images of many Rathmullen people born in the previous century, and also photographed the enduring streetscapes of the town, most of which were created in that century. The official records enable us to understand the 19th century a little better. So too do the many personal accounts from that time. Today our past is being preserved in local history publications, in the video and photographic work of Arthur Lynch and Paul Dini, as well as in projects by the Rathmullen and District Local History Society. And now, since 2018, a valuable collection of documentary films is accruing thanks to Laura Aguirre and her team working with the local community for the Rathmullan Film Festival. No account of Rathmullen's history would be complete without acknowledging the phenomenal contribution of the late Jim Dini, ever gracious in recounting his memories of Rathmullen people and times past.
I have crossed many lands, I have sailed many seas, I have seen many wonders in the world. But when I come to dream, the place that comes to me, it's that wee town in Donegal, Rathmullen by the sea. By the sea, by the sea, it's that wee town in Donegal, Rathmullen by the sea.